Good morning, 7 East. Thursday, getting down on Thursday. Good morning, everybody. It is our 17th episode of Free LEPRE Radio. I'm your host, Mr. LEPRE. We are on the air. Much shorter show for you today. I've been bombarding you with so much information, it's time to cut things back a little bit. But hopefully this show today will help you with the end part of the Adams assignment if you have not done it already. And because it's a short show, we only have two things on our agenda. First thing, how is John Adams remembered? Which will help you with the last part of the Adams assignment. And then our fun segment of the day, a word from our sponsors. This show, the popularity, it's surging. It's continuing to surge. We have some great sponsors to share those products with you at the end of our show. So first thing, big question for today. How is John Adams remembered? Well, the short answer is that as a founding father, he's remembered as one of the greatest and most important. But as a president, it is a little more complicated. So remember, John Adams was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a leading figure in the Patriot cause in the American Revolution. He helped get France and the Netherlands on the side of the United States in the war. And he was also, many people don't know this, he was the first ambassador of the United States to Britain, and he was the first American official that King George III would actually meet after the war was over. So he was pretty much had his hand everywhere in politics at this time, and was a huge contributor to the American Revolution. But as a president, his legacy, you could say, is not as positive. And let's look at why. So here I have displayed for you what many historians might look at as the pros and cons of the Adams presidency, or the good things or the bad things. So, of course, all of this really has to be judged based on your opinion, but I'm just kind of showing you what I guess most historians would say. There's a reason Adams is not reelected, and there's a reason Adams is not on any of our money, even though he's been occasionally on some ceremonial type things. Because he's generally not considered one of the great presidents. Let's try to figure out why that might be the case. So on the positive side, let's start with that. This is what Adams was most proud of, the first thing, keeping America out of war. Even though he was a Federalist, and the Federalists were very pro-British, he wanted to follow in the footsteps of George Washington. He thought it was a bad idea for America to be taking sides and fighting a war so early on in its history. So keeping America out of war, people generally think that's a positive that came out of his administration, and I believe, I could be just making this up from the TV show, but in the HBO miniseries, he said he even wanted that on his tombstone, kept America out of war. Also, kind of, I guess the second most important thing happened after he lost re-election. So he loses the election of 1800, but after losing, he helped prove that America could change governments peacefully. So previously in history, if a new person came in charge who had a very different view on things, usually that was through violence. But this showed that through an election, you can have a total change of the government from one party to another, from one point of view to another without violence. So that was another big, I guess you could, not an accomplishment, but it was a positive that came out of his presidency. Now for the negatives. The Alien and Sedition Acts, those were probably the biggest negative people point to. So early on in the country's history, and it seemed like these laws were directly against the First Amendment, even though these laws were barely on the books. Punishing you for saying things insulting about the government or disagreeable, that's seen as kind of a big stain on his legacy, violating the First Amendment with those laws that were repealed as soon as he left office. Also, his presidency was marked by increased fighting between political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists are going to go extinct. They are going to go the way of the dinosaur. Adams is the only Federalist president we have. After him, the Democratic Republicans basically take over, and you don't really have a powerful multiple-party system till much later. And then, of course, one of the results from the Alien and Sedition Acts was that Adams had inadvertently increased tension between state and federal governments. Remember how Thomas Jefferson wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with James Madison challenging the federal government? That is setting up something way down the road, conflict between state and federal government, that it didn't need to get to that point so fast. So in the end, as a president, Adams, you know, you can't say he was a failure, but Certainly, I would not give him a great grade, and I guess historians would not give him a great grade either. Um, but he had a lot on his plate, a lot to inherit, to kind of change, and it was kind of a crazy time, especially early on in the country. But he probably made most of his contributions, or his positive contributions, before he became president. And eventually his son is going to become president, John Quincy Adams. We're going to look at him in a couple weeks as well. So that's the basics of the Adams presidency. Certainly not in the A range. That's not where I would put him if we were doing the grading part on the end of your notes where I asked to give you a grade. He's not an F either. I think he's somewhere in the middle. But there's room for disagreement on that, and you can say whatever you like on that section of the notes. Now, just to kind of end on a more positive note, I actually got to visit some monuments related to John Adams and John Quincy Adams a couple of years ago or so. I went to visit Rhode Island, then drove to Boston, and I actually got to visit the place where John Adams and his son, the president, John Quincy Adams, happened to be buried. And they have this plaque in the church of where they are interred underneath. And you can see it kind of lists his accomplishments. Signer of the Declaration of Independence, framer of the Constitution of Massachusetts, second president of the United States. So he's honored with this plaque. And if you go in the basement of this church, you'll actually find there's like a tomb on the inside interior. And I actually got to go inside. It's pretty interesting. It was very cramped. And I don't think you're normally allowed to go in there, but I guess on that day they opened the gate and I was able to get inside. So if you go in, you see it's John Adams and John Quincy Adams married with their wives. So the first ladies as well are buried here. And they put an American flag on the tomb of each president. So here we have John Adams. That's where he's buried. And then John Quincy Adams, his son, who's going to be our sixth president. And they're buried side by side with their wives. And they told us not to touch them, but I couldn't resist touching their tombs or sarcophaguses, coffins, whatever we call these things. And I remember when I touched it, it was all like slimy and weird, so I hope it isn't some zombie thing. They're going to emerge in those tombs and get revenge on me for touching their stuff. Here is John Adams' house. This is before he actually became president. So he lived in a very simple house in Massachusetts. They preserved this house, kind of rebuilt a lot of it. But it's very weird because it's stuck in a very like city or residential area. It doesn't look like it fits in, but they tried to preserve it from how it would have looked way back when. And then later on, after he was president, and then when he moved back to Massachusetts, he had another house. This one, I believe he nicknamed the whole property Peacefield. It's a really, on the inside of the house is actually pretty interesting. He has this 2-floor library on the inside. They wouldn't let us take pictures of it inside because the books in there are like hundreds of years old. But it's a pretty nice house. I mean, not something you'd expect presidents today. Like I can imagine presidents today probably live in much bigger mansions. But for the time, it was kind of like living like royalty in America. It just gives you a little insight into how Adams lived. And if you're interested in his career and his life, the HBO series John Adams is actually great. It's only, I think it's 10 episodes or less, but it's a really good series. And it even shows what happens after he's president. How I mentioned how him and Thomas Jefferson used to be friends and they became enemies. Well, eventually, at the end of their lives, they actually reunite and become friends again, and they actually die on the same day, July 4th, 1826. Oh, weird thing. 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence dying on July 4th, 2 friends. Very odd. That's all for Adams. So now a word from our sponsors, last segment of the day. Oh, in these trying times, as we're struggling to make sure that we have enough food during the day, always good to have something extra handy. And I can tell you that lately, I've been making eggs pretty much every day for lunch. But one of the things that constantly gets in my way is that when I crack an egg, the shell always ends up with the rest of the eggs. I don't understand it. I can't master the art of cracking an egg without getting the shells in. But this is perfect for me. The pre-cracked egg saves time, no messy hands. Looks delicious. You can preserve it, leave it on the shelf, leave it in your cabinet. Yeah, the pre-cracked egg. And this kid right here, he says, I enjoy. So you know that you're getting the best possible information from some of our customers. Oh, this is great. Parents these days, being home with kids, it might be tough to make sure you're watching your toddler run around the house as you're trying to do work from home. Well, that's why we have this, the Stay Baby Harness, or the Stay-Bee Harness. So make sure that your toddler doesn't run off. You can hook them onto a door frame or any type of vertical structure that has a place for hooks. Make sure your child does not go anywhere. The Stay-Bee Harness. Last but not least, our third product for the day. It's making food fun again. We have the Henry Remoulad's cheese printer. To create beautiful meals for your family, just say cheese. So if you're at home and you're looking to make your meals a little bit more interesting, you can take slices of cheese and put pictures of family, friends, enemies, and so on these slices of cheese, and then put them into sandwiches, hamburgers, cheeseburgers, or whatever. I can't believe it took so long to make an invention this necessary. I doubt the ink is toxic, because then they wouldn't be able to sell it, but the cheese printer, I'm going for it, and we're happy to have them on board as one of our sponsors. And that is our last sponsor of the day, last segment of the day. Thank you for watching and listening. Friday show tomorrow, last one of the week. Have a good one.